다 제라도 내숨이 깨와 가봐서야 되지. 룰을 때문에 인데 배경을 뒤자도 직벌에 she당의 룰을 때문에 비치스 가능한 게제디 봐.
So yesterday we had reached this section where it's a specific refutation of attachment, attachment and so on, arising from the three humours. And the position of the person here is the mind is supported by the body because attachment arises from phlegm, aversion from bile, and delusion from wind.
당아 저기 소구디 기 죽차라고디 자위 중화시체 다 대대 냠도 아니 부관남 가스지 남가 딱한도 중앙가라고 들어와.
So as for the basic constituents of the body, of the physical form, there are the four elements to which then we add space. But this is that compounded space, so the space that we have. So there's five.
다 류낭로라 중화시기 자와체에 되더니 창념보도 여보이나 아는 아주 류대탕세 다 류를 나자면 대탕도 세계제체.
So when these four elements are in a state of balance, or when they're in a state of equilibrium, then one is considered to be in a state of well-being or health.
다 중화시디 참만용바체제 중화시디 참만용바체제 아니 누가 체중 규르바이나 아니 아주 수분나로다 나자게 고주다 수부 대당 많이 받아 니주 레로다.
Whereas when then there is some sort of imbalance in these humours, in the elements, or there is a predominance of one over the others, then there starts to be the first signs of some sort of physical imbalance and therefore physical symptoms of it not being well.
다 게임라고데라 아니 세레 아니 졸람레 딘데기 게임베 아니 낭기 주거시데라 체중기 흉체중기 뇌버체중기 캐바 육소나 아니 아주 중화 참원요베 세전 간달 참원요베 차로에체.
And so the conditions that lead to this kind of imbalance can be either food or just generally one's hygiene or one's physical, the one takes care of one's body, which then, because each thing may have a different kind of impact, or the intensity with which these kind of conditions can impact the body, they impact in the same way the elements, and then they can, based on what the condition is, they have an ability to either in more intensity or with less intensity impact the elements, which then get into a state of imbalance.
So that di kadudela 아니 중화시 참만용부 디낭로네 지로기 겐디데 토니 중화시 참만용부 차베 카두데라 아니 서더 추기 중원이부디 냠도 가두이는 초대체 군이기 뉴바 제디 류부 나로라 서더 추기 중원이데 냠도 체체 디기 내가 제일 슈크셔르치 룽다데네 룽기 중화데다 최기 중화데라 그 마냐마 체체 마친인디 아니 서주기 중원이고 디기 슈긴지 슈긴도 지금 아주 지금 리그로 다 텔라 백엔스 딱 거라고 다 처음에 미시메 이나야 거라고 쳐봐이나 백엔스에 어디를 질러 비었다.
So I don't know the more kind of, I guess the more technical or the more subtle meaning of what phlegm is, but one way that it is explained is then when there is an imbalance in the elements, when the kind of imbalance that arises is an imbalance where there is a predominance of water and earth, these two then they kind of mix, and when they mix with each other they become predominant, and what happens when they become predominant is the abilities of wind or fire, the heat or wind, they reduce, and so you have a predominance of earth and water and a decrease in the ability or the functioning of heat and wind, which then, when there is this kind of predominance of these two, water and earth, that's known as a manifestation or a predominance of the phlegm of the three humors.
So the pagan said la tini do passage the gain says. So the passage sagi jungwa che, gain said chugi jungwa che, tiniam to soba yena, and tiniam to soba tigi, one to subunang lola, ta kuniniam to soba tigi gain cheje, and shugin digi, one to lula naza gea de la, and it jig me train yam do, like link, changwagi da naza de subunang lola ya peltruya. 아니 매기 중화 다 트레기 중화 냠도야 덴데기 겐체자 아니 고 룽기다 간다 룽마레 가사 남주 장원의 저기 셰디에게 다 지금 뭔고지요와 어딘도 상마 도스니 용구요레스 다 도시에고다.
So the Tibetan word that here is translated as phlegm has two parts, which are be gen. The be refers to the earth element, gen refers to the water element. And so when you have this, what we're translating as phlegm, it's when these two combine or when they're in a mixed state. And when these two mix, they don't allow the functioning or they don't allow the other two, which is wind and heat, from acting or from their abilities, they get diminished. Their strength is weakened. And because that strength weakens, then all the problems that you hear that are associated with a lack of heat in the body and a predominance of cold and wetness, all of those ailments, they start to come about more. And all the symptoms that arise when the body has a predominance of cold or this kind of wetness, I think it's called, and the things that would happen when there would be wind or heat, those are not there, and there's a predominance of the other ones. And so all the ailments associated with these start to manifest as the symptoms.
So the Karazo Tona Yugiri, Mijigla, Kachujo Yodevici. Kachujo Yodevici. To get Namshi Tango the Shem Watch, the Namshi Tau Nalole, there's Sibu Yunabi, Lasan, Kadosh. The cow than Lasani, Geba than the one of the Kema Tango Chadia, Gebani, Jig Tango Chadia sort of. The Digita Tangi Nazari, Gonzo Lady Jorwa, Takanda. 매기 중앙 trading 냠체 장외 아니 실비기 중앙 다 실비기 슈치부 차인데 어디디 용대디 고 유년라고디 대경이 치고 그랬어 보다.
So what they say is, and you must have noticed this, that there are some people who, as their, like it's a constitution, their constitution is one of easily feeling cold. Of course, when the weather is cold, they feel cold, but even in other situations, the predominant way they react or their constitution is one of always being slightly cold. And so what that results in is then all the symptoms that are associated with the predominance of cold in the body, where the kidneys get cold, the lower back starts to hurt, there's certain problems with this area of the body. And so all of these are when there is a predominance of cold, and therefore the feeling or the temperature actually reduces. And when this happens, it prevents the heat from acting on the body. And so when such symptoms are observed, it is said that these are the symptoms that arise from a predominance of phlegm.
아니 칼라 사제 아니 포와나로라 칼라 슈에디 조 내가 제디 아니 매기 중화 최기 제기 여버인데 아니 즉 백엔 펠침바이나 아니 매기 최디 냠체 아니 칼라 슈마도야 디슈마도 이게 아니 가지고 단다 포화기 다 지금 나자지 여러와 캔서기 지망 저와 용대디 고 백엔데 저와 찬 용구요레 스타디시기요.
So what they also say is, for instance, especially this is observed in one's digestive system, where for being able to digest food, the quality that's necessary is that there's a certain amount of heat that the stomach or the intestine needs to generate. And so because the stomach requires this heat to break down and digest food, in people who have a predominance of this phlegm, this heat is unable to do that, and all the issues that are associated with digestive problems, and especially a lot of the cancer that happens in this area, they say is a result of an increase in the phlegm.
다 중화식이 나오니 매기 중화디 중화시 참만요 붙이지 매기 중화디 안 뉴버 채워도 피립 채워도 다간도 치료기 겐다 세다 가리기 겐베이네 코기 내가 제일 슈침부치 중화 신이 누버디 마도스 냠침베이나 아니 딘디기 중화 텔레 나자게디에 텔라 나자딜라 티고스고.
Whereas the other one, which here is called bile, that one is when of the elements there is a predominance in the heat or in the fire element. And so when the fire is predominant, it prevents the other elements from kind of manifesting their functions, or it suppresses their functions. And when there is a predominance of heat, then that's the condition over here that's known as bile.
소자다 티과디 펠바이나 코 메기 중화디 슈크처로 두고 여바인데 랑싱이 티과디 슈크처로 로바이나 티베 나자디 되는 거죠. 사와파래야 상마 다 티과도 저와 깨지시기요.
So when you get a high temperature or you have fever, that's said to be connected to increase in bile.
단 양미세게 티과디 펠도 되가라 나도 수구낭로기다 나도 로와 침바세 다음에 여러 개마든데 디 낭로네 슈크체와도 이펙트에도디 침바레세 원다 침바다 되는 가도 다 블래더 식도 골 블래더 식도 어디서 그 믹스기야 그 티과기 레가치 사기 대화 슈충부시고 왔다.
So of the various organs that one has, the ones that seem to be most affected by an increase in the heat or in the fire element are the gallbladder and the liver.
다 중원시 나로네 야 지고 세도 졸음로 소가 된디기 겜베 중원시 숨디 레가치에게 누버도 충분치 룽기 중원의 슈크처를 침베이나 룽기 중원의 슈크충부 침베이나 나나도 룽기 나자서 계제도 시고 그렇다.
And when of the four elements, the one that is predominant, with the suppressing of the other three, which are earth, fire, and water, which get suppressed, and the one that is strongest is wind, then at that point we say that that comes from the third humor, which is wind.
So the lungi nazadi yobayina, and it dig neda sort of mas shayundi, and it chiki karisore, mi lungshi tau, and it gain chunju of some condosa chojo. Dirba, and then Habordo, Sheba, Namdo Jokoshu, Gedech, Sheba Katuina, Digo Hulimedevich, and Digi game medium was hearty Katuina, and Geja Sheba and Geja Joko Shebuni, Karina Jokocha Cheguni, this is Homa Lungineta Shegota.
So generally it's held that when you manifest certain symptoms such as being easily irritable or kind of always very distracted or very hurried, or you do everything in this kind of very fidgety way, that's the result of a predominance of wind, because then at that point the mind is always moving, it's always doing things, it's always incessantly thinking. And because there's this incessant thought, a person is not able to stay calm, a person is unable to just stay. And when they speak really, really fast in this kind of uninterrupted, very chattery kind of way.
당무수도 시시라고도 가르라나 착시 전부 발대야 직제 아니 가서 니쿠마도 해야지 니랍선 쿠마도 해야지 셰바수 뒤마도 해야지.
So the most obvious signs are, for instance, when you have high blood pressure, or not being able to sleep, because at the time of sleep what is required is for the mind to kind of settle down or become more subtle or become softer, and this predominance of wind prevents that from happening.
소자다 룽지 베겐 세다 룽티고 베겐이 남네 숨세 계제 셰데버디 가조 지기 수분나로겐데 베나 로서로 로 나자라나 로 고라는 유비 나자들 로 나자슬라기로와 아니 개만나서 치만나서슬라고와 또 룽지 베겐 세데 어딘디 계제 미버체 룽지 베겐 세디 고 중화시 참원용 디간에 나자 민다샤지.
So normally when we speak of something being wrong with the body, we identify an organ. So we say something's wrong with my lungs, with my kidney, with my liver, with my spleen, whatever you might say. this way of talking about, or this way of diagnosing physical disease is not related to individual organs, but it's a way of diagnosing disease, and giving these names of the three humors is not organ specific, but it's a condition where there is a predominance of one of the elements over the others.
딘데 인류 강라 아니 가서 비명기 민주 시당시도 딘데 서로 또 통고를 당가 또 십사도 미신다 시기 가서 수분나로라 시기 년가 연날에 수분나로 나자카리 연다 가서에나 디나라 카레도 백테리아 카레도 바이러스 카레도 다시 텔라파비 멘투 스타해지어 봐 가서 비명기 민주 시당데 딘데 레미도.
So the way Tibetan medicine treats conditions, this is my way of looking at it, it's not, I don't know if it's right, but generally nowadays when you have Western medicine and the way it diagnoses things, is it tries to identify either a bacteria or something that is there that is kind of the cause of a certain ailment. But over here, instead of looking at it in that kind of a specific manner, it's a little more vast in looking at how the elements are and how they are interacting with each other, which one predominates over the others.
So the lungti pegengi kembe ne kawa kawa kange thigi yobaina ani junga khari khari chanyum gi mebadi chik ngunji cheya ani zata che ani junga cha khari nyum gi mebo ngunji cheya ani thela pa me ani junga chanyum ye gi chedo ta bena lung shukchumbo ya parting ri ji meina ta lung di ma ja go ba yindi ko loma da di meto da jibu sing khashela rikhashi siju rikhashi rangsingi mi seveina lungma jayala pendo yodeba da kada jiwi rigdinde yodeba wa dinde yobaina dinde gi mendi sueje lungme seje de tang yongde lungma jago.
So for instance, when Tibetan med doctors, or when they diagnose certain conditions, they look at which body part might be suffering and then see what sort of imbalance there is over there. And then they also check the pulse, and through the pulse they try and gauge what kind of elemental imbalance there might be in the various areas of the body that seem to be experiencing discomfort. And when they identify that, the kind of treatment that they give, for instance, if there is a predominance of wind, then the treatment that is required is to reduce this kind of overactivity of the wind element, and then to seek out certain plants or flowers or herbs, roots, bark that have this quality of reducing the wind element. Then when you consume those, then that has the quality of reducing that wind element, and therefore you see that you get better as a result of it.
The dinashi darande cancer me payment and tesa dash payment save in cancer le pingi to get out of zigitwa mimango sagali to jaga shuli or tesa ta khadu goro cancer ki je na karena di mewa sotu go marota di khade gejet ki marota.
So for instance, nowadays Tibetan medicine is very popular amongst many people, especially amongst Indians, for treating cancer. It's becoming something where Indians really line up a lot to receive Tibetan medicine as treatment for cancer. But clearly Tibetan medicine doesn't act on cancer by acting directly on the tumor.
The amji sonza khadu di meba inaya ko cancer di khanda koran buddha gari di chigi yoba inaya ta ko yunga gi kenra wode nangi jungwa ji chamonyo mo ton yungu yoba indi tela pawe an lyugi jungwa chanyome gi minchi tangsha ba indi khadu buddha sema to naya jungwa di chanya ba so yindi ani amji soege dawani ba digi mare sayade pimesan lo ni sum denge de mangu shira chongorta.
So that's why even though you can't maybe work directly on the, is it the cancerous cell that you call it? What is it? Is that what it is? Yeah. Even if the medicine cannot work directly on the cancerous cell the way maybe modern medicine can, because that imbalance, the development of these tumorous cells or these cancerous cells are the result of an elemental imbalance, when they treat this imbalance with Tibetan medicine, a Tibetan doctor often is able to make someone who has been given 2 to 3 months to live for many more years, and that's something that's extremely common these days.
Ta di lungti pegen somgi nazala nelan ta khandeji lagi meta rakwa ji sarta.
This is kind of a very coarse presentation of what these three humors, phlegm, bile and wind, might be.
땅아 변명체 명에 leadership 사시에서
Because I'm not versed in medicine, there's not much I can say about this.
다 단단히 시에디에디 딘데기 중앙 쪽버디기 내다지 시에서 류기 내다지 시에서 다 직부지산다 단다 커지디 가리라고 그래 룽 사다 축이 중앙이 보지 숙청부 차인데 딘데기 geb에 나다 백엔세 나자디체 디기 백엔 텔레 가리 용고와서도 아니 나서줄라 단다 깨대기 되샤 대바몽 깨대기 되샤디 정말 백엔이 중요해요. 그래서 딘데 백엔이 되샤 다 디르다 시고요 뭐마디.
So what we're trying to actually understand is what the opponent's view here is, which is much like there are certain symptoms associated with each one of these three humors. The opponent here is saying not just physical symptoms, but even mentally, when you have a predominance of this phlegm, which is a predominance of the two elements, of those two earth and water elements, then what you see as a result is that that person has heightened states of attachment. So attachment arises from phlegm.
다 틱바 tangi 메기 중화디인바 메기 중화도 슈춘부 디체 펠데바 디기 틱바 나서스 계제셰디 텔레 아니 가도 셰단키기요레스.
And from bile they say aversion arises.
아니 룽레 디무.
And from wind delusion.
다디 단다 네숨 단다 네숨부 텔레 니몽숨 계단디 가도 베베민 숑기디 고아마레 단다 디 근다 단다 거지란다 양 지로버 양면 말한 게.
So here, this position that these three mental states arise out of the three humors is not the presentation according to the Buddhists. This is a Charvaka presentation.
Tibetan medicine with
It's not from Tibetan medicine that these three imbalances lead to these three different emotional states. That's not Tibetan medicine. This is the position of the opponent here, who is the Charvaka.
Oh, did that the any lungti pegin something anzolo yoyo baresta kajiki samodirita jungwashi ngazu lubudi koron jungwashi le tubde ba yindu lungti pegin something yoyo bari lungti pegin something yoyo ba yindu kana ani pegin le deja lungle ani tanda tigwali shedang lungle timudi kigi yoba yindu ngazola tanda nesum segido karsa chakosumni nyamonsumni kededi lodinde kededi oda jungwal tene kigi resta deshi ma cherala gyenda shigi yerda.
So what they're also saying simultaneously is as long as you have a physical body, this physical body is composed of the four elements, and as long as it's composed of the four elements, you're always going to have these three humors. There is no state which is a physical state devoid of these four humors, which is why then when they try to identify in greater detail what these various emotional states arise from, they say, well, they're always going to arise from the body, and in the body it's more specific to these three humors.
Tadipa ka yungdu pandin shuragi disongre tulchirs tubichirs lungsogi chö ma yins la yungdu nesum chöjen nesum sigidu kasa nyeba chaksola sobu sumbudi chöjen ani nesum le gigres nesum ngwejeres la kerang labshaba di mitete ani josu rodo tubi yeshas ta pena tuwa meli keba dela ta tuwa meli musu gigi yore gegorwa 맞아 미둥이 군지셔고와 다 두어 미 제소 로도디 딱다 용기 매바 이나 아니 두어디 매기 아니 디부레스 깨제딩도 셰도고 말와 어디나 신체제 아 녀바 숨부디 내숨보다 제소 로도 딱다 용기 민도스 제소 로도 틀기도스 디임바 연디 아니 내숨기 무지기 셔 랍도고 말레스.
So in response to this, Acharya Dharmakirti says, because it is mistaken, they are not qualities of wind, etc. And what it means here when it says it is mistaken is if you say the three emotional states, so we call them the three poisons, which are attachment, aversion, and delusion, or ignorance also sometimes. When these three, if you say they arise from the three humors, Acharya Dharmakirti is saying is this is not true, it's mistaken. And what it means over here when it says it's mistaken is that the fact that it follows from the three humors is mistaken. So the fact that you're trying to claim that the three poisons follow the three humors, that is mistaken. For instance, For smoke to be the effect of fire, smoke has to follow fire, and in the absence of smoke, there can be no fire. So smoke follows fire. This following fire is not mistaken. So here in the commentary it says forward and reverse pervasion or counter pervasions are mistaken. What it means is the three poisons being the result of the three humors is mistaken because they do not always follow the three humors. Which means whenever there are the three poisons, they don't have to be preceded by the three humors, and the absence of the three humors doesn't lead to the absence of the three poisons. So because this is the case, what you're claiming to be this relation between the two is mistaken, and they're not qualities of wind.
So the 백엔진 되자 충라 시당체와 통시르스 다 아주 디세기도와 단다 내숨 단다 내숨 숙체중 유명이 개발 간데 하고 그러려나 내숨 유명 체중 내숨보디 체중 유명이로와 미디 티고슈체와도에 백엔체와도에 롱슈체와도에서 라이드도 디 내숨보 숙체중 유명이 개발이 아주 미기 수기 입는 민다와 개발이어야 돼봐. 아니 미디기 류가기 전함 단기 계제시에 넘어나시 카시 칸을 계절합상 시에라 가보여 되게 카시 칸이 계절 뒤에라 데스 고르되게 네 가기 전함 아니 류기 전함 아니 미기 수부기 입 아니 수부기 덴데기 토니 칸다 미디기 랑신디 오디 미디 룽슈 체와드레샤 디 백엔 체와레샤 디 티고 슈 체와레샤 세디 네숨기 랑신가라
So, for instance, it says over here the reason why this is mistaken is because one can see people with a predominance of phlegm that have more aversion than attachment. And so, what it's saying over here is, for instance, they also do mention how one's physical type, in terms of the size that one has or the shape that one has, and so the physical state, as long as the verbal way in which one speaks, so the verbal conduct or the physical way that we act. The verbal way that we act is that we respond instantly without any pause, or we take a long time to reply, we have a very slow speech, an unclear way of speaking. So through a predominance of one of these humors, you can actually see, they say that you can see that there is a distinct difference in the physical state, which is the body of someone who has a predominance of one over another. And this is observable through the way their body is, through the way they speak.
So that dindegi lungagi cholam the migi suib dindegi tone rangshin ko pegenda kari chejung yume gejejik sheje yore da zo chik zataje ani pegen chewa yume da kari yume gejejik shik sheye sare.
So one way to kind of diagnose which predominant trait someone has is through this kind of looking at how their physical state is and how they speak. But another way, which is often used to identify which is the predominant state, is by looking at one's pulse.
So that tanda bandishura karisungore oda dindegi takji cheyungdu ani mi richigla pegen shukchewa yobachigla nyamong kediegi nyamong tuksumi nangne 되자 총아지 세랑체와 용의 통해 도스 디인디 백엔디 되자기 유이나 백엔이 되자기 백엔이 되자도 백엔 거리기 최인바이나 아니 지점이 미들 백엔체와 속에 되자체와 요고바 지글라 아니 리지글라 백엔체와라 녀몽게야디 세랑체와 되자 총아 용의 통해 도스 디인디 추수 제수로도 추기도 세대.
So what Acharya Dharmakirti here is saying is when you diagnose someone, you can actually diagnose which humor is predominant. But when you have found which is a physical humor that is predominant, often when you diagnose someone to have a kind of predominance of this phlegm, you do see, however, that they have more aversion than they do have attachment. And so if phlegm or this predominance of the humor phlegm was the cause of attachment, the way you say it is, it would not be permissible for such a person to have a predominance of aversion. That's why you claiming that this is the cause of attachment is mistaken, because in someone who has a predominance of this humor, you do see another mental state that predominates in their emotional state.
That tell a kajigi kete rangshin drebe shi kyo me chenas. Ta pegen chen la, ani shedang chumbo tong de kariche barla na, pegen nyamdo, ani tigwa dreche. Tigwa dredeba tigi, ani shedang chen tong deba res. La yundu, ani tangi nesum dinga keje she yorwa, di yundu, pegen da tigwa ni dreba ina, pegen da tigwa drene yang, ko naza kaga yungdeya. Yang lung da tigwa drene naza kaga yungdeya. Yang pegen da lung dreche. pelung deje ya na ka yung dia ko shamba nyam du mix cheje ko di india jibu ka yung yo ba indi jiri pegele deja tibol shedan re de ine pegen da kuni pegen da tibol ni na za nyobu nyam du de yung du ani pegen je la shedan thong de ri gyumjen de res.
So the opponent here replies by saying it's not a problem. I mean, what you're saying is not really a problem, because when someone who has a predominance of phlegm gets angry, or you see that their emotional state has a tendency of anger or aversion over attachment, that's because at the causal state, which is this humor, which is a predominance of phlegm, that becomes mixed with bile. And so when phlegm and bile are mixed, then you have a different emotional reaction. Similarly, when phlegm and wind are mixed, you have a different emotional reaction. When bile and wind are mixed, you have still another emotional reaction. So in someone who has a predominance of phlegm, that they can be more angry or be more averse is not problematic, because that phlegm itself has a nature that is mixed with bile when it demonstrates aversion or anger.
소자 드바 백엔지 셰당 셰체와 통완니 백엔라 셰당 그 규칙베 랑신 제비 인셰나스.
So here the commentary says, if you say, so the opponent presenting the opponent's presentation here, a person with a predominance of phlegm that has more aversion is because the natures of the cause of aversion, which is bile, are mixed with those of phlegm.
다 텔라 랑루그 니주 땅인데 디슈 텔렌 셰엔 지미 통스. 다 백엔다 백엔 여대베 카도 될라 틱베 랑신 제제 틱베 나자 제제 틱과 딜 셰당디 게 백엔전라 셰당 통데 틱과 레바 디기 레스 라면도 안 틱과 레바 디기 셰당 게바 디게 시기 여베이나 아니 디 내가블라 아니 틱과기 디부델라 다 틱과기 디불라 로게 로디나로라 셰당 게 거와 다 셰당 지고 말이 류라 가리게 거스도 류라 아니 틱베기 디부델라 가서 지기 튜마임바다 겐고 찬타가우 차이데 니주 카가지 튜마임바 트라가우 차야 아니 지기 믹스에우 차야 아니 무나 망고 퇴야 수부 차와치야 다든조 상마 단다 디 티버기데 디부르와 디인디 엔데데기 가사텔라 기시 티버 데버 디게 샤단 게버레스 라바이나 아니 디 내가르 티베기 디부 셴양 통고구로 와스 티베기 디부 셴양 남비카랑 셰디에기 든조 통고구로 와스 엔 든조 마 통고미도 와디 카르레스 어디 디숭기여 디체 텔레시엔 지미통스 제바낭로라 틱바 디체 튜밍기 짜카르와다 샤세르와다 물마와소 셰당레 셰당 텔레시엔베 디부 셴바든조양 카르신 통고마니스 통고구로 와스
예, 샤세바세 디로게.
샤세와세 땅아도 빠과디한테 도르기 요사리 틱바 슈즈모 페바이나 타고르동아도 믹스에우 차이디 요스 틱네 제스레기 왕아도 나게.
So in response to this, Acharya Dharmakirti says, why are the qualities of that not seen also in others? And what he is saying here is, if you're saying that someone who has a predominance of phlegm, when they demonstrate signs of aversion or anger, you are saying that this is because this phlegm, this humor is mixed with the nature of bile. If this is what you're saying, or this is the reason why they then show signs of the results of a predominance or the bile humor being active, why is it that in this person you don't see also the physical signs of bile? And the physical signs of bile are early graying hair. So graying hair not due to age but at other phases of one's life when hair starts graying, which is associated with a condition such as bile, or yellowing skin. But not just skin, another very obvious one is when your eyes start getting yellow, or excessive perspiration. So because these are commonly associated as physical symptoms that result from a predominance of bile, if you're saying that the bile element is active, which is why the person is angry, then if that bile element is active, they should also have the physical symptoms of a predominance of bile. But why don't we see that in someone who has a predominance of phlegm and is getting angry? That's what Acharya Dharmakirti is saying here.
Tayang kajigi ta ne re la tangi lawa nashi pegen le deja tigwa le shedan se su maja wa che ne re nyamo tu sungwa ki gresta tu sungwa ko le ki gresta geje di ta kerange ko ngone la gwe mi shi da ta ko ta che gorwa kide ne sumbo re ne tu sungwa ki gresta lawa yenas.
So then now here the opponent has another view. Now whether the opponent is really saying this or not, I don't know. But here the way that you're proceeding is one where with each response you give another view, and then to reply to this another view is presented. So another view is presented here. Whether they actually say this, I don't know. But if you reply, each of the three humors individually produce all three poisons. And here what they are now saying as a result of the discussion that has been proceeding is, okay, it's not that each individual humor produces an individual one of these three poisons, but each one of these three humors individually can produce all three poisons.
딜라바이나 탐주 뇌자 총반데 텔치르스 다 군기 최마이스 소자 네바 somebody 네레레레레기 상마 네 숨부 차단 끼기래라는 차단 깨어 마인데 근데 제바이나 아니 기부 탐지 뇌자 총바 태기래스 답변나 가르쳐 골라나 nga pegen she cha bache ani shambadi lung she chewa yana ta pegen le decha lung le decha niga gi decha gi gyina decha gi niga gi decha gi yoba yana ani mi lung she chombo yodenge de da pegen she chombo yodenge ni budela ani niga gi decha gi yoba decha 체중 충보라고 주고 그러봐 아니 군일 decha 미 충보디 하고 그러봐 나도 통해요 그러봐 어디인데 아니 내리리리 두숨과 깨게요나 아니 기부 상마 미상마라 되자서 체중 아니 총바태를 태워 두고도.
To which then Acharya Dharmakirti replies, because it would follow that everyone would have similar attachment, it is not a quality of all. And what this means over here is, if you say each one of the humors produces each one of the poisons, then two people who have different predominance of different humors should, because that difference of one humor and another humor now is no longer individually producing a different kind of effect, but they're all equally producing all the three poisons equally. Whether someone has a predominance of one or not or of another one would not be a justification of them having a predominance of one emotional state over another, and all of them should be similar in the level of attachment that they have. But because we don't see that everyone has a similar level of attachment or a similar level of anger, this, what you're saying here, is not accurate.
다야 가지기 규중어 총제 텔레기비 기부 숙체주 미송바 신호스 다 ngazu 숙체주 민다 망고도 와 기부라 소다 숙체주 민다와 요래데 딘데기 숙체주 탐지기 규바 대체만 중원이뭐 총바로 와서 규중원이뭐 총바래데 이내야 텔레게디니 숙데라 기부 숙을 치중 통해 도왔어 딘나 신체제 아니 내 숨가 깨사디 가사 네버 차수 로수보디 깨사디 내 숨리 끼고래 내 숨리 깨바디 총바래 상말라 이나야 기부 상말라 아니 네버 로수보디 치중 총고에 개요 말이스.
So here the opponent then says, well, no, it's not like that, because it's similar to how form, which means the size of the person, is also different in each different person. And what they're saying here is, since the source of all the bodies, or whatever physical form one has, when you trace it back, the causes are all the four elements. But even though the causes are the four elements, at a resultant state, you do see certain people who are taller, smaller, bigger, thinner. And since you do see this change in physical sizes, which is the different forms that people have, even though they have all arisen from the elements, similarly, even though all mental states arise from the three humors equally, just because the humors are the cause of all three of them, it doesn't mean that the resultant states also have to be the same, just as with form.
디인도 가지기 숙소신 꿰매 제나스
which is why the opponent says, if you say there is no fault as with forms.
다 텔라 랑루기 게데 텔라 케버처 레나 다고 마이나 대한 접어 충과 있어. 다 기부 숙치중 예대바 대탐지기 숙탐지기 규중화인 바 충바레스. 규중화인 바 충바 있나야. 중화텔라 뉴바치중 이게 시작오레스. 뉴바치중 상관념 대바 있나? 아니 숙치중 이게 시작도 말고 왔어. 뒤인데 코 중화텔라 뉴바치중 이게 시작오레스. 중화대로 누바치전 게제 시에인데 아니 지기 숙충부 차에게 누바치어 여도 지라 숙도 충부랑 주에메게 누바충어 여도 게제 시에고디 딘디기 중화코라는 누바치중 동긴디 다 너무 상계베 제바이나 텔라 다긴 겐셴바 요레스다 겐셴바 요레스 소소기 소남다 레단데 망부 게제 시에 요레스.
So in response to this, Acharya Dharmakirti says, if those are not controlled by variations in karma, in that case too, the argument is similar. So what Acharya Dharmakirti here is saying is, if when you talk about the elements being the cause of different sizes or different forms in different people, if those elements did not have different potentials or did not have different abilities, then you would not be able to account for how all the elements that are identical in their abilities can produce different shapes, different sizes, and different forms. If, however, you do see different forms, it has to result from the elements that, even though they might be the elements, they all have different abilities, which then result in the different shapes. And for these different elements to have different potentials in different people, there has to be something that endows them with these different potentials. And from the Buddhist presentation, there is a further condition that endows a given element with one potential compared to another element that has a different potential, and that is the merit that one has, the actions that one has done, or the karma that one has accumulated. So it's not just that, even nowadays, like that medically you can intervene and you can give certain supplements that then make your your body create larger or become taller or become thinner or become smaller. So even that can intervene as a condition that then alters the size that emerges.
Sonzata losumbodi nesumga likigi res lawatsa mayimba nesumga likigi yobayina ni ken kangi nesumbo de rene shukchero chero do tsugi telike de nyegi loten shukchero chero do gu was pena sugbu de jungwa le tugu yoba yindi ken kangi sugbu gi jungwa de shukchero do tsugi ani midi gi sugbu de top chero do gu was di yindi ani desha karso gore pekin shukchimbo peding dela ani dejayan shukchimbo yodegi shenayan shukchimbo yodegi timuyan shukchimbo kaisno ko gyute yindi nechigi 독순가 끼게 여봐야지 코겐 가리기 코슈충부 땅와이나 텔레 로순가 끼고 그러 로순가에 체를 로고 왔어 아니 디 로순가 끼고 체를 로고 여봐야나 디 누구메 와디 가도 통투고도 왔어.
So if it is the three humors which individually, so each one of the three humors produces or has ability to equally produce each one of the three poisons or these three mental states. If that is what you're saying, but then you're saying when a certain humor is activated or becomes predominant because of a condition, much like if your body and your elements are acted upon by certain conditions, there are certain elements that have a predominance that then manifest as a different shape, as a different height, as a different kind of body type. Similarly, when you have the three humors that are acted upon by certain conditions, and let's say the bile humor grows more than the other ones, but at the same time you claim that this bile is producing all three emotional states, when the bile element increases, corresponding to its increase, you should also see an increase in all three of these mental states, because you're saying that this thing produces individually, has the ability to produce all three of these mental states. But the fact that these three mental states do not arise at the same level of the same intensity is also verifiable. Therefore, you claiming that each one individually can produce all three doesn't really pan out.
디인디 차소기의 규기 랑신라 개발매 대바 아니야 디부 차소를 체중이야 대바 다 딘디게제 시고초나 규드 디부기 아니 규기 필집당 디부기 필집니부디 미숭 대바지 어 딘디인디 딘디기 토네 아니 네숨보레 차로스 녀바 로숨보디 게바디 셰토구민도 스타 자와치마디 시기요레 차소 랑신 탐지기 최인방인 되놓고 누메 랑신 메베나 디부 미숭 칼리인스.
So if, however, you say that an increase in the causes does not lead to an increase in the effects, and an increase in the effects is not exponential as the increase in the causes, it doesn't increase exponentially as the causes do, then claiming or asserting this to be a cause of that or that to be an effect of this doesn't really work out, because an increase in the cause should show as an increase in the effect, and a decrease in the effect should be the result of a decrease in the cause. But that, if this is not verifiable and this is not how it's working, then it's hard for you to show or claim, assert that this is a cause of that, which is then demonstrated in the next verse, which says, even if it is asserted that attachment and so forth are qualities of the nature of all, since there is no nature without potential, why are the results not similar?
데바 차소 백인소 랑신 탐지 용어적이 최인바 되나 네숨기 차소계의 누발의 개발매나 차소기 규이 랑신의 개발매베 디부 차소 치중 미숭바 강례인데 탐지 되자소 치중 총바 도메뉴소.
So the commentary says, if it is asserted that attachment and so forth are qualities of the nature of all the humours such as phlegm, etc., there being no difference in the potential of the three humours to give rise to attachment and the others, etc., there would be no difference in the nature of the causes of attachment and so on. In that case, why are the results such as attachment and so on not similar in their intensity? One will not be able to respond to the critique that everyone should have the same intensity of attachment.
다 디기 된다 닝부디 간다 규드 디부 닝부디 펠딥 숭미민도 디인디 페드미 숭베 윤제 멤버 템바스 자와체 윤디 규남 케버 윤나야 케버 메처스.
So then it carries on, because the increase and decrease are not concordant, so because the increase of one is not concordant with the increase of in the other, or vice versa, showing that they are not cause and effect is then the next two lines. Though there are variations in faults, there are no variations in attachment, etc.
데바스 차소 네군기 문제기 최마인데 룽나 송비 균 내남 케버드 페와 연나야 차소 케버드 페와 녀바 메비처스.
So the commentary then says, furthermore, attachment and so on are not qualities that are direct effects of all the humours, because even though there can be variations in faults such as the winds from an increase in the humours, there is no certainty that there will be an increase in the variations of attachment.
다 텔라 카지기 랑로기 피딥 송금민도 슬라베디 피딥 마송바 따마로 피딥 송그레스 페나 틱바 페나 샤당 페와 통구도 와스.
So here the opponent says it's not true that it's not concordant. It's not true that an increase in one does not result with an increase in the other. And so they say, if you say, which is the opponent, it is not the case that increase and decrease are not concordant. And what they mean over here is they're saying, because we do see, because from an increase of bile and increase in aversion is seen, we do see people who have a predominance of bile being more angry.
다 덴데디 틱바 페와레 샤당 페와 통위 시스 라비 유두간라 대zam기 다 단다 계란기 틱바 페와레 샤당 피기두슬라에 균제지여와 간신나 미카직라 틱바 나자 숙충보 여데가 아니 룽차보 통대바 덴데 두어슬라베나 덴데 카실라 통와 대zam기 아니 틱바 페와레 샤당 페와 두투구 마레스 대zam기 두투구 마레스 제 마투니 대zam기 딱 마투바 마인데스 가르치는람나 마인 탐지 규로만 교식군을 깨워민스 딜라두간라 틱버점 마인바 백엔 펜의 샤당경에 통해도 룽펜의 샤당경에 통해도 통해 여바인데 아니 계란기 룽페와라 샤당 페기레스 라바이나 디그르베스 틱버 차도 와스 어디세고.
So here in response to this, the answer says it is not invalid, and what it means over here is it's true what you're saying, that in some people who have an increase in bile, they do get more angry. But this itself does not invalidate the reason that we have said, which is that the arise in bile is not sufficient to be a cause in a rise in or an increase in attachment. This example does not invalidate the reason that we have given. And the reason it carries on to explain is because were it the case that your reason invalidates our earlier argument, then it would also, however, follow that changes in all would bring about change. Therefore, they do not arise from all, which means a change in every one of the elements or of the humors would have to bring about a change in something else equally. But that's not the case. We don't see that because sometimes we see an increase in aversion arise from an increase in bile. Sometimes we see an increase in anger arise from phlegm. Sometimes we see it arise from wind. And so just because you see an increase in something when there is an increase in one of the humors, if that was enough to say it, then you're also going to have to say that all of these states are the result of in each one of these humors. That's also not working out. And so even that's not okay.
That the candidate lava ina, also Dayan the Gaji Shi, Dayan the Yumina, and Dadina, Sevadi be Kabachkor. Tunjo Tonga Zamgi, Tunjo Yoba Zamgi, Digio Mari, Tunjo Conal Yogo, Dayan the Ina.
So, where this is important in what we've done in Tariq is when it has to be a correct sign, the reason has to be established on the subject. But that's not enough. If you remember, the reason has to be established wholly, entirely on the subject or on all the subjects we said. So just because you can see an increase in attachment being there in an increase in aversion, resulting from an increase in bile, once is not enough. It has to be in all of the subject. So for it to be the property of the subject, it has to increase entirely on the subject. And that's why for it to be the first mode, just seeing it in one instance is not enough. That's where this is how you can explain this here.
So that pena, Manzo Ngaji Girwa, Shenle Rang Cho to Cuba is Ngaji Girwa. Ngaji di Rangla, Shenla maybe Yundenji, Yunding Tony Manzo Ngaji Girwa, Yundin Tongs and Ngaji Girwa. So that they do Galata, Kerala Yundin Kazu Chewa Yunati, Yundin Kerala Chism, Kerala Yundin Yobati, and Kerala Ngaji Gures, Chism Kerala Yundin Chewa Yobati Sugi, Kerala Ngaji Cherogures, Labaina. Ta Ngaji di Rangi Yundin Sambal in Ngaji Kigore, and Ngaji King Manchewa, the Rang Yundin Lamini Ngaji Kigo Yorete, in a Yundin Yoba Samda, Yundin Chimbu Yoba Samgi, Middle Ngaji Kaba Yomaris, Mikashi Yundin Chubushu, Yimba Yinaya, and a bet Ngaji Mebashin de to me, Toyantua. So that the Indu ko Ngaji Kebati, and Yundin Yungela, Ton Samgi, and Tunjola Ton Samgi, that de Conala doos. Say, the Conal Modu Mindu say Gejadi, Shewachuna Kaburetua, or the dinner she charted.
Similarly, again, the key sorry, so this was not just with the property of the subject, this is more with the forward pervasion. That was my mistake earlier. So here, for example, having like when someone has an exaggerated sense of pride, this pride often comes about when one sees certain qualities or one sees that one is able to do something. So pride generally comes about when one finds oneself particularly capable or to have certain positive qualities. But if this were enough for it to be the cause of giving rise to pride, then the more qualities someone has, one would have to see that there is going to be an equally higher level of pride or arrogance or a sense of an inflated sense of self that arises from it. But it's not true that one sees an increase in one's own arrogance always related to having an increase in one's qualities, because one also sees someone having a lot of qualities without having any pride. And so if you were to equate having or being proud with an increase in qualities, that would have to always be the case, and wherever there is an increase in the qualities, you would have to see an increase in one's arrogance. But because you see people with very qualified or very realized with very low sense of pride or a sense of inflated self, this is not going to be enough for you to say an increase in pride necessarily exists only in the concordant class having high qualities.
So the tanganzo mi rik chigla, mi cheraba chigla, ane ngul mangbo yoba digi, ngul mangbo yoba da, ming chumbo yoba digi, kola ngaji chumbo yoba ngazo tongya duwa. Ti tongya yoba gyumze de cheje, ane ngul kazo yona ngaji chiru dugures, ming kazo chewa yona ngaji chiru dugures, laosna kyabada dugumare.
So you do see people who are very rich, they have a lot of resources, they are very well off, they are very popular, they are very famous, and all of this leads to them having a very big head. You do see situations where this happens. But if you were to conclude or deduce from this that having a big head is necessary for having these kind of causes, then wherever you have these causes, you would have to say that you have to have a big head. But you don't see that either. So you can't say just because you have a lot of wealth or because you are popular, or you are well known, or you are famous, it has to result in you having an inflated sense of self.
Di na shen cheche, ane mikha jigla tikwa pelni shadangi wa tongya yore. Di gyumzengi, ane tikwa di shadangi gyure shan, so the tikwa pelni shadang pekwa reslana, di kebi bindu se wa diritula. So
basically what they're saying is, in some people who have an increase in bile, you do see an increase in aversion. It's true. But if you see it in this one instance, for you to draw a general rule from this by saying wherever there is an increase in bile, you will have an increase in aversion, this pervasion you will not be able to establish.
Ta thanda nganzo jigdenpa mangche gi dewi yuta de mangche wa dinde dogre. Mangche wala sangma la khepgi yo mare mangche wa jigla ko di phel yo na di yo na ko kiba do yungo thong de du ada dewi yu de dire sha samje ani changme gi dil shu gya de gorwa. An khaba mewa di kharela na an di yo na dewa matum de dinge thoyen do.
So most ways that we try to kind of be happy or satisfy ourselves right now is in this way, where sometimes something happens that makes us happy and we equate our happiness as a result of that event. But the reason why our happiness is not necessarily tied down to that event is because it's also true that with an increase in that kind of situation, there is no necessary corresponding benefit that one always has to feel, or no resultant happiness that is always present.
So that do stugura do stoyende ani mi penjo yago yo denge so ani to skibu de de thong yende ani penjo yo na mi skibu do was what that mi skibu gi penjo lu munje chero ani penjo to samut khoro wa.
So for instance, if you step outside and you go around and you see people, wealthy people having a good time, the mind is very quick to associate the two and say, oh, the cause of being happy and being well is money, and therefore wealth is a sure way to get that kind of happiness, and therefore then you kind of engage in wealth or accumulating wealth as a means to be happy.
Yeah, pugu menge dende pa lamga do story de ani pugu yo denge dende pugu di phama shabji shiwa thong so na pugu yo na jama yagu do was. And the jama kibu yo gi gudil di ta che pugu go sare. Teresa boku yo bar.
Yes. And then there's couples who don't have children, and then they look at other couples who have children, and these children are helping the parents, or they're kind of supporting the parents, they're being with the parents and making their lives very comfortable. And then so couples without kids immediately say, oh, the causes for us to be happy is to have kids, and so we must ensure that we have kids, and then they go and have kids. Isn't that kind of how it works?
Whereas
parents who have children to really make their lives hell, they look at single couples with no kids, and they're like, wow, that's the better way to do it. So that's pretty much what is being said here, which is whenever we identify normally a cause for happiness, we kind of do it in this way, where actually there is no pervasion that if that cause exists, there will necessarily be that resultant happiness.
딱 한다 균대이나 유도 디부이나 제수도디 캬바니 해봐시고 캬바지고 마도 갑가실을 제수도바 통 갑가실을 제수도바 통 이게 핑기 말이에요. 어디서 거다.
So when we say it has to be a cause and that has to be its effect, when we talk about causality, it's not sufficient for something to be an effect and something to be a cause if in certain occasions we see that effect follow from that cause and we see that such a cause does not lead to that effect. If you only see it in certain occasions, that's not enough for you to deduce that it's always following from it. So that it's related to it, the existence of this relies on the existence of that, and in the absence of this, that will not exist. To make this conclusion when you see it in certain occasions is not sufficient.
So that tendadela ani gyuni pewa gyubana dibu mironde tsawa soshins. The gyukazo pelna gyugnuba de kazo shukcherudona dibu deya ani shukcherudo shikogures. Shukcheru mandoba chiji tibata tsawani yungsig mars. Gyupel dibu ma tiplana ta tsawani gyuni ko dolso hons. Pena shedan kasa de tikba namju tikba gi neda de tsawa shege yoba yinde tikba kazo peba ina 미들로 수불을 되펠고 왔다 차와 펠기였다 티과 슈처를 두고도 아니 차와도 충을 두고도 라바이나 아니 자원이 군이 바로 균디게제 시도 말고 왔어 베티나시 시です.
So that's what this verse says, where it says if the cause increases, it is not suitable for the result to decrease, as with heat and so on, which is here saying if you're saying these things are cause and effect, then an increase in the cause must result as an increase in the effect. You can't have an increase in the cause and then not see an increase in the effect and instead see a decrease in the effect. For instance, if bile is the cause of something, the more the bile will increase, the more that effect should increase. For instance, the more bile increases, the more you see the heat within the body increase as a result of that. So an increase of heat can be tied down to an increase in bile. If you have no bile increasing and you have an increase in heat, or you have an increase in bile and your temperature doesn't increase, then you cannot say that this is the result of that because they're not functioning concordantly.
따오나 랑룰라 차소기 규 가레레스다. 랑룰라 차소기 규 류기 토니 용거면만 가리기 토니 용거르스디 아니 차소기 규와 디둘리케인스.
So then now when after having presented the reasons for why these other views are inconsistent, then when our view is to be presented, so then Acharya Dharmakirti, when he says, what is our view? He says, according to our system, the causes of attachment and aversion are that attachment and aversion arise from pleasure and pain.
That dilayundi diduli keba yins chaso di sorwa dewa li decha da sorwa dungi li shedan ki gires labyundi ona dajomba la sorwa dewa yorwa dajomba chawa ki go marwa dajomba la sorwa dungi yore ina dajomba shedan ki bidwa ani gundi ta da digma sowans labayina.
So then if this is what Acharya Dharmakirti says, you could object by saying, well, arhats, or beings who are liberated, they also feel pain, but they don't have any suffering, or they don't have any aversion. They don't have aversion. Also these beings, arhats, you see that they have pleasure, they have pleasurable sensations, but this doesn't mean that they have attachment, because you see that they don't have attachment. So how is it that what you're saying as a cause of attachment and aversion can be a cause for attachment and aversion when you have people who have these two causes but they don't have that effect?
Ta dilayundi ngazo tende yana chungyi shenyundi tende yana chungyi nanglo la seba khani kego re sudu sorwa le kegi yores sonza tuma mariba niba dujigi le tunduma geje shenyundi ani dumba de la sorwa ani sorwa le tene ani geba sebas ta sorwa de sorwe kene seba kego re geje dishe.
So in the way it's presented in the 12 links, the way it's presented is that you have these 12 links, and at these 12 links where you have craving is at the 8th one, and what causes this craving to arise is the 7th link, which is known as contact. And so the cause of craving is pointed as or is identified as the previous seventh link, which is contact. Feeling. Feeling, sorry. I have translated as contact. Yeah, my mistake. Feeling is from contact. Yeah.
So that tende yana chungni nanglo chorwa le seba kigire skeje shede chorwa di chitang gi chowa kya ba jamgi ani seba kigire lagi yo mare tanda de shede chorwa di khari shege yore ani tende yana chungni ma she yundi mari bi kengi ani yuda wangbo la soba ani pa chu rewa teba ta mari bi kengi yuda wangbo la soba teba la tene chowa ji kesona tele desha ke
So here, when it's talking about feelings of pleasure and pain that come about, the feelings of pleasure and pain that come about, they come from contact. But the feelings of pleasure and pain, the kind of contact that they have to come from is a contact that is coming from the first one, which is contact that has arisen through ignorance. And so when there is contact that has arisen through ignorance or is resulting from ignorance, this contact, when it then comes, when there is contact between things and the mind that perceives them, then this in the next moment leads to these feelings. And so further ahead also, it's further clarified where it says only having feelings is not sufficient to lead to craving or to lead to attachment, because between this feeling and attachment, or along with this feeling, there has to be a wrong notion or a mistaken view. So it's not just feeling in and of itself that creates attachment and aversion.
Ta sorwa dewa kandar sorwa dewa chigla ming matuna ta pena duslam digirwa ta duslam digir kanda sorwa dewa jikke be khadu thela sorwa dewa thela tanda marikba se geje shede marikba di dangji dag sorwa dewa thela dagri sungde adi ngajo dangji thela ni yore dada dagri jimbas ta dangji se gorwe jigdala dada dagri jimbas ni yore ta ngajo jeshi di shamla seu thugre so da dada dagri jimbas yaji so da dadu jimbas yadi ngao se che dagri jin se yadi ngai se che ta sozu gula sorwala soba sowa dewala soba dungela soba khari kebe khadu tela ngayu jimba nge sege ani dagri jimba di chungsona nyamdu sosona ani dosha kerur ta sorwa dewa keba yina ya ti khadu la dagri jimba di mesona ani dosha kigiyo.
So it's going to come further ahead as well, but the more clear or like a more extensive explanation is going to come ahead. But what's essentially being said here is when you have this feeling, and this feeling is accompanied with, do we call it view of perishable? Is there a better translation of this? Huh? Yeah, that's worse, no? Yeah. Can we just call it view of perishable for the sake of communication, right? So whenever this feeling, I don't have a better translation, but that perish, that disintegrate. Yeah. So this view, when this feeling is accompanied with the view of perishable aggregates, and when one says the view of perishable aggregates, there's two within it. There's grasping at an I, so there's what we classically call self-grasping, which is grasping at I, and then there is another one which is also part of this view of perishable aggregates, which is grasping at mine. And the difference between the two is, one is the thought I, and the other one is the thought that belongs to I, so the thought of mine. And what's being said over here is when there is this feeling of pleasure, then when this feeling of pleasure is accompanied with this sense of possessing it, or with this notion of mine, when these two come together, then in the next moment it leads to attachment. In the absence of this sense of possessing it for this I, or becoming, or for the I to possess it, or for it to become mine, if this doesn't intervene, or this pleasurable feeling is not identified as mine, then it doesn't lead to a resultant feeling of, resultant state of attachment.
lo yuji yore ani chumden de sheshu be kabla sormo thingwa segi miji tene mimangbo se dinge chi ta kan de bi lungsao shenang cao ji yue dinge kongdu cao yue de ke mimangbo se dinge chi ta jela ani chumden de gi jesu songche an chu den che da me bi chu de di komche da chu be ko ba thopse.
There's a story in the sutras of Angulimala, who was a person who was very angry, and he was overwhelmed by this kind of wrath or anger. And then later on, he became a follower of the Buddha. And then when the Buddha showed him the path, then he attained the state of an arhat.
Ta nimaji kong sonyam pedu du kang la, sonyam peso lungwa yuba chong digi midi zui ta konzo ge di ungli mala reshas nyamangan zui gi jik pingya seyambo, bawa seyambo, jik jik sengi diri reshe konzo gi nyeda dangche. Nyeda dangche ta shikame neme ta dongsha warwa.
So then one day when he went out to seek for alms, the village where he went, they identified him as Angulimala, and because in the past he had killed a lot of their relatives or people, their children, their parents, all of them identified him as Angulimala, and they beat Angulimala up like they really created a lot of, I guess, just destroyed him. They beat him up a lot.
Didi gilong shimba zunzo leje, choge ma dingchi, choge gana kong sha liya gyan dembe zala kele warwa.
So the other monks, the other Gelongs over there, when they saw Angulimala lying on the floor having been beaten up, bleeding everywhere, they laid down the robe, the monk's robe, and they put him on it and they took him to the Buddha.
Ani dembe zala leje, dembe ge, ani kandidus kira. Kandidus, keje chiburta.
When Angulimala was brought in front of the Buddha, then Shakyamuni Buddha asked him, "How are you? How do you feel?"
So that suku kame neme dungsha yunde, suku la chorwa dunge di yorta.
Physically, he had been beaten to a pulp. So physically, there was an enormous sensation of pain.
So that lula dunge du de semla dunge mindus la kongi.
However, Angulimala replied, he said, "My body feels pain, but my mind doesn't."
So the semla dunge karchini mindula na ngala dada dagri zimbad mindus la ta. Dada dagri zimbad meba yinde semla dunge mindus la ta.
So the reason why he said my mind feels no pain is because my mind does not apprehend it as mine, or does not have the apprehension of I or mine anymore.
So the ani chumden degi tidi gelong sarbu da course hama kongi de zo. Ungul mala da nyema da gelong zamje rema da juma hama ngi sola ani ko da jum bares. Chumden degi tidi sung bares se korta.
At which point the Buddha told the other monks who were present, who did not know that Angulimala had already become an arhat. He had already become an arhat earlier, but they were unaware of it. At that point, the Buddha pointed at Angulimala and said, "He's an arhat," and he told them.
Dire. So that ta din na wasangi begi yanko tumo maimba chita sheda. Dagri mazina, dadu mazina, kange medebchi. Dagri mazina, kange tigi medebchi. Dada dagri zin sona, ani kange yung tigi yevchi. Sidiyu kanla ani tanda yue deba ti chikbugi, sorwa dewa yue deba chikbugi dosha ke tuku mewachi. Di yundi kola ani gen shenpachi, da keja shedeyachi.
So this again is kind of it's unique to how the Buddhists present it, which is if you have a pleasant sensation or a pleasant feeling, but you don't apprehend it as mine, or your mind doesn't have the notion of I, or it has no further self-grasping or grasping at things as mine, then even though you might have a pleasant sensation, this does not in itself lead to attachment.
So
like a further more detailed explanation of this comes further down.
Da rang look this che. Da yang kaji dus labre. Kaji gi da pegen pewe kap la 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 decha mi pewa di tadong ko uzu gyeji da. Pegen pewe kap la la decha pegen pena decha pewe kyagi mi du wasta. Pegen pelche ane pegen je decha ma pewa che shedang peding tonya du wasta dangi nga zo zoba de zerwa. Da khoge yang uzu kari gyare 백인 폐에 깝지라 백인 피기 연나야 지단 백인이 되자기 규래 백인 폐나 되자 폐고래데 이나야 백인 폐나 되자 미폐어 바디 야 디바로로 바지지 쇼아지 나자 셴바지기 객체제 그 게마토레스 가레레스나 처민염지 동에기 개디 되자 미게 나스다 백인 폐에 깝라라 되자 미폐어 바디 내솜 차만염발이 깨베 내솜 차만염바 디기 동에지 깨온 그레스 동에디 깨유 동에 텔레 동에디 객체네 아니 되자 게마토 바체 되자디 살 샤당 폐와디 용바레스 딱고 렌데디 시켜버다.
Now there's another answer that they come up with over here, which is, it's true that when there is an increase in phlegm, there does not have to be exponential increase in attachment. But the reason why there does not have to be an exponential increase in attachment is not because phlegm is not the cause of attachment, but because what happens is when there is an increase in phlegm, along with that, there is another condition that arises, which is a suffering that arises from the imbalance of the three humours. So there's an increase in phlegm, but along with that, there is something else that arises, which is a suffering that arises from an imbalance of the three humours. This acts as an obstacle that prevents phlegm from producing attachment. So even though phlegm does produce attachment, why in certain occasions an increase in phlegm does not produce attachment is because something else intervenes and prevents the production of attachment. This thing that intervenes is a suffering that arises from an imbalance in the three humours. This is now a new response that they come up with.
가릴리 되자기요 가리펜나 되자피기 디 다동 세우 민두스 디인디 되자기 주 다동 타미 주비 되자 강리 기기요 다동 캐라 14부 3번 라쇼스 지기 메시스.
So here the Acharya Dharmakirti says, well, it's not really clear what you're trying to say is the cause of attachment. So what is it? If it's not this, then what exactly is it that you are identifying as the actual cause of attachment? That's why the verse says, tell me what will produce it, which is, since it's still unclear what is the cause of attachment, tell me what is the cause, what produces attachment.
Pena chamanyab dungedigi, chamanyab junga chamanyab teliki dungedigi, ani pegen la decha cheje, pegen la gek cheje, decha ke la kangu chegi yobayina, ani di dungedigi pegen pe la kagu was. And decha ki yudi pe la tan maga ka neje kan chetu ko mebayina, and dibu dikai la khandising. 다 남중 안도 객시에 윤디 객디기 규딜 까기요 규딜 디부디키엘 규딜 디부디키엘 누바딜라 깨마주신 까고르와 걔는 규딜라 가양 까금이도 가서 백인 패되고 얼었어 백인 첨부도 왔어 고gen기 제메도 왔어 안 디불 고진 시스라디 다 세우잔 두스다디.
So what Acharya Dharmakirti is saying here is, if you have a cause that is blocked or is an obstacle arises that prevents this cause from producing the result, then that's okay. But here, your situation that you have created is one where where phlegm is still increasing. The production of suffering or this arising of suffering from an imbalance is not intervening by preventing the phlegm from increasing. There is an increase in phlegm, there is a predominance in phlegm. And however, despite there being a predominance in phlegm, you're saying there's no increase in attachment. If there has to be a cause that is being prevented from producing its effect, that cause cannot be allowed to increase in its intensity. You have to act on the cause by reducing its intensity. Here, however, you're saying, while there is this suffering that arises from an imbalance, the phlegm continues to increase in its intensity. How is this then why is this a cause for the result where the cause is increasing and what you're claiming is an obstacle doesn't really do what an obstacle does? Because an obstacle should reduce the intensity of a cause. That's not happening. So it's still unclear what you're talking about as the cause of attachment. So what is it?
감가르보디 페바이나 아니 가도 텔레도샤기고 그랬어. 텔레도샤기기도 왔다. 그 차냐마이나 고 감가르보 펠도에. 디 펠바이나 deja sheru 통구도와 디인지 참 민영바 되게 아니 객식이 어디 독스트레스 딱고 일라버려.
So the way that they respond is the way in which an imbalance prevents attachment from arising is that were there no imbalance, so were there a state of balance, from the state of balance you see an increase in semen, this increase in semen that increases in the body then acts as a cause for attachment, which we observe. So because there is this imbalance which is preventing a state of balance which would have led to an increase in semen, this is now why there is no attachment arising in someone.
다 딜라바 이나야 되샤디 내숨부 차냠바 델라야 저수도도 틀기도 시래. 추바 간데레슬라나 자와델라 차민냠라 차진통 셴 마냠 나야 means.
So here Ajay Dharmakirti replies by saying even this that you posit now as the cause of attachment, which is an increase in semen, even here there is no pervasion, or the reasoning again is mistaken, because wherever you see this you don't see that, and if you see that it doesn't have to be followed by this.
Pena nesu chamanyamba yedingi kibugashi aniya chakwa shushubu pedingi tonya duwas.
So for example it says, from the verse says, from imbalance those possessed with attachment is seen, in others even in balance none is seen.
Ta keran cheba ina nesu chamanyamba yindi ani kamkagu mi peltugu yomar chanyamba ko pes laba yindi ta ko nesu chanyang meba yindi ko pego marwas. Pegi meba yindi ko deja me peba gugorde nesu chamanyang deja pelding tonya duwas.
So what you're claiming here to be the cause of attachment is an increase in phlegm with a state of balance, and with a state of balance then you have an increase in semen. In the absence of the state of balance, in a state of imbalance, you don't have this increase in semen, but in such a person who has a state of imbalance where you're saying there could be no potential increase in semen, you do see attachment. So there is no connection between these two.
Ta kuwa pebale ani deja pelwa tonya yorede ina ya deja pelwa di ani kuwa pewa jesu drogugure lawa ina di drogugu mindus shene sene chaza yang pumechigla kumewa tiji lacha chame gyurs.
So for instance, even in others, when you do have this increase in semen, it's not always seen that it leads to necessarily a state of attachment increasing. And for attachment to increase, it's not necessarily that there has to be this increase in semen, because in both cases, you see that that's not the case. In some situations, you might observe this kind of semen connection, but it doesn't always follow. So then it says, even the pervasion with an increase in semen is mistaken, because in others, though exhausted until blood drips, without certainty that semen increases, they would not develop attachment to a woman.
차진 가시 코어스는 차자양 다동 부면을 찾고 있고 통라스. 김진직 김진 셴바직라 부면직고 될 찾고 슈 잡고 있게와라. 아니 코어 패와 부면텔을 미니 코어 패고 녀바 케민도스.
So in the commentary, in the explanation, it says, in some who are lustful, it is seen that even though semen is exhausted to the extent that blood comes out, they still have attachment to a woman. However, according to how you've explained it, it would follow that such a person would not have intense attachment towards a woman, because when they see a woman, there can be no further increase in semen.
다양 크게 양자 가지되게 다 당기셔야 되는 상마 고래 디가는 양자를 야 수경 고래스다 미과데 미견대양 고그랬다 미견 유유도 미견대양 고그랬어 속 제발라 소바 디조야 되샤기베 양라도 고그랬어 딱 가지고 둘라브로 계제 속소 양 양라스.
So at this point then the opponent turns around and says, no, that's also not enough. What you need is also you'd have to have an attractive form. So you have to have an external object, which is a very attractive form, which acts as a condition to lead to the arising or the growth of this attachment.
다 델라랑로기 마인스 대야 얘기민도스다 마인 꿈 망예비 치르스 녀바 메바 중화 means 연대 민진 발랑 교르스.
And so they say other secondary factors such as an attractive form are needed, to which Acharya Dharmakirti says they are not, because there is no certainty for all. Also, without ascertaining it would not arise, and would arise in those that do not apprehend its attractive qualities.
So the suk zebatia chakwi gu yalado gugresno migote da gebala changina da pumela changina da kandar tamjegi suk zebale miji chabadi gego nyeba tongmindos mangeba tongdo was.
And the reason is because whether you are attracted to a male form or to a female form, the fact that there is attachment to this form is not always accompanied with that form having to be particularly attractive.
However, 아니 ngobi sula suk zebu yoba yina ya luigi suk zebu majina ani suk zebu thona ya chaba ke moto thongu to was.
Especially in certain situations where the form is actually attractive. So in actuality it's attractive, it really is, but your mind doesn't perceive it as attractive. In such situations also, even though the form itself might be attractive, your not perceiving it as attractive also shows that you do not have attachment or you don't develop attachment to it.
다나 신기 차고 슈트하고 계속 유치림이 차고 슈트하고 계속나 유디 제바 마히나야 ngobi sula 제바 마히나야 차고 디기 딥시 제바 파통도 was.
And in other situations it also happens where the thing itself is no longer attractive, but your attachment is so, or your lust is so strong or overpowering that it makes something unattractive suddenly appear as attractive.
네 차고도 시사회절라 수제바 마인바디 통연디 nga khandes ture says dingo는 이 가진 통에 말에 세 개절이 용거로 와.
For instance, people who are kind of overwhelmed with this, they're absolutely in love or they're overly lustful, then suddenly when that clears off and this fog clears away, they ask themselves, they're like, how did that happen? Like, how did I fall for such a person?
So the dindu sukjeba tiyan chakwa kewe yanlado gugumidus.
Which is why even an attractive form is not a factor that leads to attachment.
다양 가지기 다 sukjeba 짬말에 sukjeba di yundinjinu jimba di yanlado gugures. 다양 안gel라리 양코이.
So now they come about and they say something else. So no, it's not enough that there is attractive form, but the attractive form has to be recognized as attractive form.
Kede sukje yundin jimba tiyan yanlado goslana. 다 딜랍디 간라 탐지기 yundin jimba jingyudi gyule kheba mesheros. 다 yundin jindu jinseedi 코란 sukjeba yimba 계제들이베스 sukjeba yimba 통화 대가랑기 sukjeba yundindu jins la고 그러베 양코 sukjeba yundindu jin야라 양 샤바시 거레스. sukjeba yundindu jin야라 파로보도 sukjeba지 구구 여르베 양 가리 구고 거레스.
So now the next question is, well, for you to apprehend attractive qualities as attractive qualities, is it necessary that the qualities that the person possesses have to be attractive qualities, or is that not required?
다 파조들로 sukjeba yundin 여버sam기 yundin진도 진구고요나 아니 미수이나 sukjeba 통나 yundin진도 진고가 태도 그래서.
If you're saying that it's enough for the attractive qualities to exist, for you to apprehend them as attractive qualities, then anyone who comes into contact with an attractive form would necessarily have to apprehend it as attractive.
다 sukjeba koran sukjeba yundin진도 진비 규마이나 아니 텔라 yundin진도 진보로 규신 가르고 그래서.
Whereas if it being attractive was not sufficient for you to perceive it as attractive, then what is this other cause that makes you apprehend it as attractive?
다 sukjeba yundin진도 진야라 아니 sukjeba di yundinre 세 딘데기 콤바 ngargi 콤바딘데라 라리 그래서. 다 딜링 갸바이나.
If you turn around and say you have to be familiar with that kind of form, or you have to have had this habit, you have this habit of seeing that attractive form as attractive. So if you've got this habit, if you have this familiarization from the past, then when you see attractive form, that previous habituation influences you to see it as attractive. If this is the answer that you give,
딜라바이나 다 캐랑게 라게 되다 다다 주버레스 게 당부네 랍송아스 아니 류레 중앙레 류레 이로도가 기기 요 말에 공발리 기기 요래 했으니 그 당부 딱 꿰서 따디기 된다도 주버레스 캐랑.
So which is why if you see in the commentary of it, it says, if you say it comes from seeing what one is familiar with as attractive or not, then what you're saying now corroborates what I've been saying from the very beginning. You remember when I said initially from familiarization, attachment, and I said that attachment and these things do not arise from the elements, but they require their own previous forms of familiarization and their own habituation, which leads to you having attachment later. The same thing that I've been saying from the beginning, that the elements cannot act as a cause for attachment or for mental cognition, you by answering this way have essentially proven what I have been saying from the very beginning.
다 차소 내수다 피디 충나 하장 대화다 피디 충기 매 피디 충기 면도와 피디 충기 매바시 기지 충바이나 하장의 대화 가리열라나 내가 강라 차중도 된다 시당 지미죠 디니 오 미수치 대랑에바 통함했어.
So then further down in the curly brackets it says, showing the absurd consequences if attachment and so forth were concordant with an increase and decrease of the three humours. And the verse is, at the times you assert someone possessed of attachment, they would not be possessed of aversion. Because the nature of these two is different, at that time the absence of aversion should necessarily not be seen.
다디 가르쳐 걸스디 가지게다 우주기압지 피디 충그레 다동 피디 충그레스 라바이나 뇌지 셴바시 당기였다. 백엔 페와레 아니 되자 페와 티버 페와레 셰당 페와 이인스 다동 그 우주기압이나 아니 백엔도 되자니가 펠딩이 미데라 아니 가서 백엔도 티버니가 펠딩이 미데라 되자다 셰당니가 깨고로 왔어. 켈런 거로 왔어. 안 되자다 셰당니보디 냠르기 두고 말했어. 라로 디니지 당고르다.
So here the opponent is saying, no, if you insist that an increase in phlegm leads to an increase in attachment, an increase in bile leads to an increase in aversion, then when someone has an increase in bile and phlegm that are increasing or are at the same, they're functioning at the same level, then that person should at the same time have both attachment and aversion. But it's not the case, unfortunately, that someone at the same time can possess attachment and aversion.
다 랑로기 태와 땅윤디 백엔 학월 폐빈 내가도 제바 나올라. 백엔 학월 폐빈 내가 될라 아니 기부디 셰당전도 미주와 타스. 가르질라나 셰당전도 미주위 김생 가rel라나 디 내가블라 아니 차고 펠데도 와스.
And so in the commentary it says, when there is a predominance of phlegm, it follows that the person will not be possessed of aversion because it is reasonable for them to be possessed of attachment.
So 다 차고 펠와디 고랑기 켈레로 와. 가서 백엔 폐와디 차고 폐 피디 충스 라서로 와. 다 차고 폐디 다 켈레로 와. 다 켈레인디 갈라 다 차고 펠디에나 셰당 미회와디 캬바 칸스 줍도 그래라나 차단 얘기 진당 계기도 와스.
And so the reason here, because it is reasonable for them to be possessed of attachment, the reason will be accepted, it says. And the reason that they will accept this reason is because they have said that attachment is increasing. So the fact that attachment increases or the fact that they possess attachment has been accepted. So the reason will be accepted.
So that 유직람미베 차단 여부디 진단 개와인디 진단 미tum바인디 아니 유직람미베 차단 이념도 개도 말해. 야 유카가가 유수수를 미비 차단이 대한 냠도 개도 말을 로이칠레 가가 냠도 개도 말해. 어디인디 딘데 가사 백엔 패딩에 가사들라 셰당 페와 메스 셰당 페와 메스 랍고레 이네 딜라마토데 백엔 패딩에 가사라 셰당 페와 통야도 와스 디인디 결한게 자베 탐제도 죽기민도 우스고들.
And so if the reason is accepted, then the pervasion has to be established, and the pervasion is established. The pervasion is, if someone possesses attachment, it follows that they will not be possessed of aversion. The reason why this is established, how to establish the pervasion, is because the way that these two, attachment and aversion, apprehend their object, so the modes of apprehension are different. They cannot overlap. And so the way attachment perceives its object cannot be this, can't go together with aversion perceiving that same object. These two engage in their objects in two ways of apprehending their object that cannot coexist. If you say that there are two separate states that coexist in the same mind, directed at different objects, that's also not going to work, because we've earlier seen how in one mental event you can't have two mental cognitions that are simultaneous. If this is the case, then it's not sufficient for you to say, then it's not okay for you to say that an increase in phlegm is going to necessarily lead to an increase in attachment, because in someone who has an increase or a predominance of phlegm, you do see aversion bring a predominant trait.
다 랑루라 남고 상계빌루라 백엔지 셰당정도 미주비 견디 태와데 ngala 주고 말해서 가르진라나 차소디 내숨니 깨바디 녜켈링이메 랑랑기 리둥아마 바자기 캬발라 때는 주고요바디 시기요스 어디 자와디 관계 되샤 라소바 리둥 바자 캬발라 라레바니 주고요바 텔라 견딜 태와메스.
So why these same errors are not applicable to a Buddhist system here, or to how the Buddhists presented Acharya Dharmakirti says, is because according to us, attachment and the three poisons do not arise from the three humours. Instead, they operate or they arise from the habits or the imprints of their own previous similar types, which is the verse that says, here attachment and so forth operate in dependence on differences of imprints of similar types. It does not follow that these faults are here.
That Ranglu Dom di Makia to Tundu di Kare, and Lug Jumala Turba Mebar, Shebangama Namagi Pachagi Tobi Sheba Chima Chimadi, Ranglu Kiki Yores, the Indu Shebangama Namale, Chima Chima Kiamato, and Jumale, Lule, and Yulotoba Kayanda, Kavadi, Tuki Mares, that Tundu di Shigure, Kanzu Lula Temeba, Sheba Gashigi, Paja Sebi Gujuba, Tenekashi Lega is.
So to like sum up the whole thing, Acharya Dharmakirti says, in our way of thinking about it, it's not subsequent states of consciousness that arise from the elements or from the body, but each subsequent state of consciousness arises from previous states of consciousness when those previous states of consciousness come into contact with conditions for their results to ripen. So when consciousness is activated and those imprints ripen, then this results in subsequent states of consciousness arising. It doesn't happen from just the elements. And so, which is why in the verse that sums it up, it says, when without being supported by a body, consciousnesses become causes that ripen imprints of some consciousnesses, then some will arise from some.
다 yilo doji ki gyuyimba kaaba digi ani yilo di rikwa li kiawa trup ta shengi rikwa li kiawa ina ani khomba dan temba la soba dinji neba di tang yondu digi shengi rikwa li kiawa mithe di indu ta digi ani rikwa digi korangi rinda rikwa ngama ngondu songo gudu di indu rikwa ina rikwa ngama ngondu songo ya che na chika rikwa de rikwa chima tsamja gudu usta kiawa ngachi dus trubi kechare.
So how to like sum this entire thing up, how we prove over here that there have to be previous births is by proving that the body can be an indispensable cause of the mind. When this is proven, then you end up with the only other alternative, which is the mind is produced by the mind itself. If you think that the mind is produced by the mind itself, but it's not one's own previous moments of mind, but it is the mind of someone else that becomes the mind of another person, then there are the faults that are present with one's mind being the result of someone else's mind. And so when you come to the conclusion that it has to be produced by the mind, but it can't be the mind of someone else, then the only alternative that's left is each state of consciousness or each moment of mind has to be preceded by its own similar type, which is distinct from other states of mind. And when you do this, you can prove that there has to be a previous moment of mind, which then leads to understanding that there had to be a previous birth. And then at the moment of death, this mind will also continue, therefore that at the time of death, it connects with the subsequent mind. That's, yeah.